So today I want to take you inside a moment the world saw, but almost no one truly understood. On April 7th at the United Nations Security Council, something happened that looked simple on the surface, but under it, it revealed the whole power structure of this war. China and Russia used their veto power on a resolution related to the Strait of Hormuz, and within minutes, headlines across Western media painted a familiar picture. China supports Iran. Russia and China protect a destabilizing regime. They are risking the global economy. But what if I told you this story is not just incomplete, it is deeply misleading? Because here is the question no one is asking. And I want you to really think about this before we go any further. China is the world's biggest buyer of Iranian oil. A huge part of that oil moves through the Strait of Hormuz. If that route is blocked, China is one of the biggest losers on earth. So then why? Why would China block a resolution that on paper tries to reopen that same route? Why would the country with the most to lose from a blockade be the one stopping the so-called solution? This is where things get interesting, because the moment you answer that question, the whole chessboard flips. This is no longer about good guys versus bad guys, or supporting Iran versus opposing the West. This is about strategy at the highest level, about power, leverage, and long-term control. And once you see it clearly, you will realize something shocking. China's veto was not a defensive move. It was not hesitation. It was calculation. In fact, it may have been the smartest move in this whole conflict, one that quietly shifts the balance of power in ways most people have not even started to notice. All right, now let us slow this down and really break apart what actually happened, because the details here are everything, and most people completely miss them. On April 7th, 2026, inside the United Nations Security Council, a resolution was put to a vote first proposed by Bahrain. On paper, it sounded simple. Restore freedom of travel through the Strait of Hormuz. But hidden inside that resolution was a very powerful phrase, all necessary means. And in diplomatic language, that is not just wording, that is permission. Permission for military action, permission for escalation, permission for war under international legitimacy. Now here is what happened next. 11 countries voted in favor. China and Russia vetoed it. Pakistan and Colombia abstained. And right away the story was locked in. China and Russia are protecting Iran. Simple, clean, easy to understand, but completely shallow. Because what most people do not realize is what happened before that final vote. The original draft of the resolution was extremely aggressive. It would have basically allowed any nation to use military force to reopen the strait. That is a huge step. That is not diplomacy. That is escalation with legal cover. And several countries, including China, Russia, and even France, pushed back hard. They said this goes too far. So the resolution was revised. The language allowing offensive force was removed. It became softer, more neutral, more acceptable. And still China and Russia vetoed it. Then it was revised again. This time they removed even more authority. They took out references that tied it directly to Security Council enforcement. At this point, the resolution had been weakened a lot. It was no longer the same aggressive document it started as. And still, China and Russia said no. Not once, not twice, every single time. Now listen carefully to how this was framed. The U.S. ambassador said China and Russia stood with the regime trying to threaten the Gulf. The UK ambassador said they chose to protect their ally. And that became the main story, China and Russia protecting Iran. But here is the real question. Are we looking at what happened, or are we just accepting the easiest explanation? Because if you zoom out and use a more serious geopolitical lens, the picture starts to change completely. There is a simple framework I always return to. Do not focus on what countries say. Focus on what their actions actually achieve. Ask one question: who benefits? So let us apply that to China. China imports about 10 to 11 million barrels of oil every single day, and a huge part of that supply moves through the Strait of Hormuz. On the surface, that means China should badly want that route open. It should be pushing harder than anyone for stability, right? Because in the short term, a blockade hurts China a lot. But here is where most people stop thinking, and where the real insight begins. China is not playing a short-term game. It never has. While other countries react to immediate pressure, China thinks decades ahead. So yes, in the short term, this disruption creates pain. But in the long term, changes it creates, the shifts in power, the dependencies it reveals, the leverage it builds, those are far more valuable. And when you look at it from that point of view, the veto stops looking like a contradiction and starts looking like strategy. In fact, when you connect all the dots, this was not hesitation. This was not about protecting anyone. This was a calculated move meant to reshape the board itself. And once you truly understand that, you realize something very few people are saying out loud. This veto was not just justified. It may have been one of the most strategically brilliant decisions China has made in years. Let me explain why this veto is so powerful. And I want you to follow this carefully because each layer builds on the last. And by the end of it, the whole strategy becomes crystal clear. Start with the first principle. What this resolution would have actually done in the real world, even in its softer, watered-down form, it would have given the United States and its allies something incredibly valuable. Not just permission, but legitimacy. It would have been the United Nations Security Council basically saying, yes, you have the right to use force in and around the Strait of Hormuz. You have the authority to secure it. And that changes everything. Because once military action is backed by international legitimacy, it is no longer just power. It is power with approval. Now think about what that means strategically for China. If the United States steps in, reopens the strait by force, and pushes Iran into submission, it sends a very clear signal to the whole world. America still controls the most important energy choke points on the planet. It proves that even in a so-called era of decline, the U.S. can still decide who gets access to energy and who does not. And if that becomes the reality, then China is right back where it has always feared being dependent on American-controlled sea lanes, dependent on a system where at any moment its oil supply could be threatened. In Chinese strategic thinking, this fear has a name, the Malacca Dilemma. The idea that the U.S. Navy can choke China's economy by controlling key sea routes. Now imagine that same weakness reaching Hormuz. That is not just a risk, that is a strategic nightmare for Beijing. So from this point of view, the first conclusion is simple. If America wins here, China loses. And if China understands that, then blocking the resolution is not optional. It is necessary. But now let us move to the second layer, because this is where it becomes truly fascinating. What happens if the strait does not reopen? What happens if the disruption continues? On the surface, yes, it hurts China. Energy prices rise, supply chains tighten, uncertainty grows. But under that short-term pain, something much bigger is happening. Something China has been quietly working toward for decades is being sped up, because the closure of the Strait of Hormuz does not just disrupt oil flows, it disrupts the whole financial system built around those flows. To understand this, you have to understand the petrodollar system. Since the 1970s, global oil trade has been ruled by the US dollar, largely because of an agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia. Oil is sold in dollars, which means every country in the world needs dollars to buy energy, and that creates steady global demand for the dollar, letting the US finance huge deficits, support its financial markets, and keep its global influence. In simple terms, the dollar is not just a currency, it is the backbone of American power. Now here is where the disruption changes everything. If the Strait of Hormuz stays unstable or partly closed, Gulf states struggle to export oil smoothly. The flow of petrodollars starts to weaken. Those dollars stop cycling back into American assets, into stock markets, into tech investments, into the very systems that strengthen US dominance. And as that system starts to feel pressure, countries around the world begin asking a very dangerous question. What if we do not need the dollar anymore? And this is exactly where China's long-term strategy comes into play. Because for years, China has been building alternatives: yuan-based oil trading systems, cross-border payment systems linked to the Belt and Road Initiative, and deeper energy integration with countries like Russia and Iran. These systems do not matter much in a stable dollar-dominated world, but in a world under stress, a world where traditional systems are cracking, they suddenly become very attractive. So what looks like a crisis on the surface is in reality an opportunity underneath. Every week that the Hormuz situation stays unresolved, the pressure on the dollar-based system grows. Every disruption pushes more countries to try alternatives, and every alternative that gains support slowly shifts power away from Washington and toward Beijing. And this is the key insight most people miss. China is willing to take short-term pain in exchange for long-term change. Because if this trend continues, it does not just weaken American influence, it completely reshapes the global economic order. And in that new order, China is not reacting to the system anymore. It is helping define it. Now let us move to the third layer of this strategy, because this is where most people completely underestimate China. A lot of people look at the situation and say, okay, but if the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted, does that mean China is running out of oil? Does that mean China is hurting itself? And on the surface, that sounds logical. But it only sounds logical if you assume China is reacting in real time. In reality, China has been preparing for exactly this kind of disruption for years, quietly, carefully, and at scale. Think about how China handles supply chains. It does not just plan for efficiency, it designs for resilience. Over the past decade, China has been building huge strategic petroleum reserves, basically storing energy for moments like this. It has been diversifying its suppliers, so it is not too dependent on any single region. It has invested heavily in infrastructure projects like the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which gives it access to the Arabian Sea without depending fully on traditional choke points. At the same time, it has been working with Russia and Iran on overland energy routes, such as the International North-South Transport Corridor, lowering its dependence on weak maritime lanes. And maybe most importantly, China has been aggressively building its domestic energy capacity, solar, wind, and nuclear, on a scale the world has never seen. This is not just about climate policy. It is about strategic independence. It is about making sure that when disruptions happen, China does not collapse under pressure. It adapts. So yes, blockade creates short-term pain. But here is the key difference. China has planned for that pain. It has buffers. It has alternatives. It has backup built into its system. And when you compare that to other major economies, the United States, Europe, Japan, South Korea, many of them are much more open to sudden energy shocks. They are more dependent on stable sea flows. They have fewer immediate alternatives. So what looks like a global crisis is actually a stress test. And in that stress test, China is one of the best prepared players on the board. Every week this situation continues. The systems China has built become more valuable, and the American-controlled maritime order becomes a little less dominant. Now let us go one level deeper, because this is the part almost no one talks about, the legal and moral side of the veto. Inside the United Nations Security Council, China's ambassador Fu Kong made a critical point. The resolution did not address the root causes of the conflict. Russia's representative echoed the same idea, that the proposal blamed Iran while ignoring the actions that caused the escalation in the first place. And whether you agree with that framing or not, the argument itself matters, because think about the sequence of events being debated. Military strikes are carried out against Iran, a sovereign state. Its facilities are targeted, its leadership is hit. And then after that escalation, a resolution is introduced asking for international approval to use force against that same country, because it is now responding. Step back and look at the logic of that. From the view of many countries outside the Western Alliance, this does not look like keeping order. It looks like setting a precedent. And this is where the global perception shifts across parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the so-called Global South. There has been a growing doubt about how international rules are applied. Many countries have watched similar patterns for decades. Intervention first, justification later. So when China vetoes a resolution like this, it is not just making a geopolitical move. It is sending a signal that it will not automatically support the use of force under these circumstances, a signal that international law should not be applied only when convenient. And that creates something incredibly valuable for China, narrative power. Because suddenly China is no longer just a rising economic power. It is positioning itself as a defender of sovereignty and a critic of selective enforcement in the global system. Meanwhile, the United States, which often presents itself as the guardian of a rules-based order, finds itself being shown, at least in some parts of the world, as a country that bends those rules when it helps its interests. And in geopolitics, perception is power, because wars are not just fought with weapons, they are fought with narratives. And in this moment, China's veto did not just block a resolution. It reshaped how the whole situation is being understood by much of the world. Now let us step back and look at the biggest layer of all, because this veto is not just about a waterway or even about a war. It is about the kind of world we are moving into. For years, I have argued that we are moving from a unipolar system, where the United States dominates and sets the rules, to a multipolar system where power is shared across multiple nations, and no single country can force its will without resistance. And what happened on April 7th inside the United Nations Security Council was one of the clearest signals yet that this transition is no longer theoretical. It is happening in real time. Because what China and Russia basically showed with that veto is something very simple but very powerful. The Security Council is not America's rubber stamp anymore. For decades after the Cold War, the U.S. worked with a level of global freedom that no empire in history had ever enjoyed. If it wanted to intervene somewhere, it could. If it wanted to sanction, isolate, or pressure a country, it could. And if it needed international legitimacy, it could often get it because Russia was weakened and China had not yet risen to challenge that system in a serious way. But that era is now over, and the Hormuz veto makes that painfully clear. Because here you have a situation where the U.S. goes to the UN asking for approval for something it describes as essential, keeping a critical global choke point open, and it fails. Not because of technical issues, not because of procedural delays, but because two major powers looked at the proposal and said, "No, we are not going to allow this." That is a structural shift in how global power works. It means there are now real limits, visible, enforceable limits, on what America can do through international institutions. And most people are missing this because they are focused only on missiles, ships, and troop movements. But wars are not decided only on the battlefield. They are fought across systems: military, economic, political, and narrative. And if you really want to understand who is winning, you have to look at all four at the same time. So let us tie everything together with that framework. Imagine you are not an observer, but an investor, a strategist looking at this conflict and asking one question: who is gaining power across all dimensions? Militarily, China has not fired a single shot. It has not sent troops. It has not spent billions on weapons. And yet, with a single veto, it has blocked the United States from getting international legal cover for military action. That is an extraordinary result, shaping the battlefield without ever stepping onto it. Economically, the impact is just as important. By stopping a quick resolution, the veto keeps pressure on global energy flows, and more importantly, on the dollar-based system tied to those flows. The petrodollar system stays under stress, and every moment of instability pushes countries to think about alternatives, many of which China has already been building. At the same time, China's own preparations, its reserves, diversified supply chains, and domestic energy growth let it absorb the shock better than many of its rivals. Politically, the move is even more powerful. China presents itself not as an aggressor, but as a defender of sovereignty and international law. In a world where a large number of countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America have long doubted Western interventions, this position connects deeply. It builds trust. It builds alignment. And it strengthens China's influence in regions that will shape the future global order. And then there is the narrative dimension, the most underestimated battlefield of all. Right now, China is telling a story that is incredibly powerful to much of the world. We are not the ones escalating conflict. We are not the ones starting strikes. We are the ones saying that rules should apply equally to everyone. Meanwhile, the U.S., fairly or unfairly, is being shown in some parts of the world as a country that acts first and looks for justification later. And in geopolitics, perception shapes reality more than most people realize. So when you look at all four dimensions together, military, economic, political, and narrative, you start to see the full picture. This was not just a veto. It was a multi-layered strategic move that pushed China's position forward across the board while costing it almost nothing in direct conflict. No war, no escalation, no huge spending, just leverage, timing, and precision. And that is what makes it so important, because in the kind of world we are entering, power is no longer just about who has the biggest military. It is about who can shape outcomes without using it. And in this moment, with this single decision, China showed that it understands that game better than almost anyone else. Now let me address the biggest counter-argument, because this is the point where many people push back. They say, fine, maybe China's veto was smart in the short term, but China is still hurting from the oil disruption. China cannot live like this forever. Sooner or later, it will have to support reopening the Strait of Hormuz. And at first glance, that sounds reasonable. In fact, it sounds like common sense. But the real issue here is not whether China can endure this situation forever. Nobody can. The real question, the only question that matters in strategy, is this: who runs out of time first? And when you look at the conflict through that lens, the picture changes dramatically. Because America is burning through time much faster than China is. The United States is not just spending money here. It is spending military stockpiles, political capital, and domestic patience. Interceptor missiles are not unlimited. Public support is not unlimited. Economic tolerance is not unlimited. Every extra week of instability, every jump in oil prices, every wave of market anxiety adds more pressure inside the American system. It puts pressure on consumers, pressure on investors, pressure on the administration, pressure on Congress, and pressure on allies who are expected to share the burden. Wars are never sustained by weapons alone. They are sustained by public support and financial endurance. And both of those things are much more fragile in America than most people want to admit. Now look at Iran. Iran is not operating from the same pressure as Washington. This is a state that has lived under pressure, sanctions, and confrontation for decades. It has built its whole strategic culture around endurance. It has spent years preparing for exactly this kind of long confrontation. So, while outside observers assume Iran must be close to collapse, Tehran is actually much more used to attrition than many Western capitals are. It does not need to win quickly. It only needs to avoid losing fast. And then there is China. China is not untouched by this crisis, but it is positioned far better than its critics assume. It has reserves. It has alternative supply plans. It has overland corridors. It has domestic energy growth. It has a government system able to absorb economic pain in ways liberal democracies often cannot. So yes, China is feeling the squeeze, but it is feeling that squeeze with buffers already in place. It is not making things up in panic. It is working from preparation. And this is why time itself becomes the weapon. Because if America is losing political support, economic stability, and strategic patience faster than China is losing energy security, then the side benefiting from delay is not Washington. It is Beijing. And that is exactly what the veto accomplished. It did not solve the crisis. It extended it. It stretched the timeline. It stopped a fast. American diplomatic and military win. And by doing that, it allowed the economic and political costs to keep building, mostly on the American side of the equation. This is why I think so many analysts are misunderstanding the nature of this war.